Hello and welcome to the next episode of our podcast. Today we have with us a very special guest. She deals specifically with high conflict divorce, which, as we know, has still recently been seen as the norm. Most divorces are, very conflict-ridden situations. There's a lot of bitterness, resentment, anger, and we've been culturally conditioned by the idea that the couple that is separating needs to somehow, they end up tearing each other apart. And it is wonderful to have someone who's specializing in supporting people who are going through a high conflict. In some ways, very much a counterpoint to the work that I have been trained in for conscious uncoupling. But as we know, it's not always very easy to handle the conscious uncoupling, especially if one of the partners is particularly aggressive, abusive, or even narcissistic. So it's wonderful to have with us our guest here, Reena. And I will request you, Reena, to introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, I'm Reena Grunfeld, or however you want to pronounce my surname. It's Dutch. Although I myself am not Dutch, but that's my ex-married surname, and I kept it because it's the name that's on all my graduation degrees and everything. So I started out 10 years ago, or 12 years ago, working full-time as a translator after getting my master's degree. And at the time, I was going through this very difficult divorce. We had moved to Canada 2 years previously, me and my ex. And after 2 years here in Canada, I decided to leave the marriage. And it was very difficult. And I had a lot of experiences that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But it was incredible learning curve for me. And I realized that I needed to help people as well in my situation. While I was going through this experience as well, what happened was that I started talking to other women who were in the same situation. And I actually started a little Facebook group with a couple of friends so that we could vent to each other. So we weren't like venting to our family or our friends who weren't in the situation or our new partners, because it was really too much for them. And this group just grew and grew. It's a local group for women in my area, mostly. And I realized as well, I was lacking tools to help these women. They would have certain situations, certain experiences, and I wanted to help them. And so I discovered this course to become a high conflict divorce coach offered by Tina Swithin of One Mom's Battle. Have you heard of Tina Swithin?
I have heard of her, yes. I've seen her website, yes.
She is legendary. And she is so amazing. She has so many tools. She went through it, started going through it before I went through it, and she's been such a resource. So I did her course to become a high conflict divorce coach, and that was a year ago. I finished the course just over a year ago, and now I've been spending the last year developing this new practice that I have. I'm still building it, but I started posting on LinkedIn about it. I was posting previously as a translator and about translation, but I realized that this is not what mattered to me. I already have plenty of translation clients, and I saw myself, what do I see myself doing in 10 years' time? And it wasn't being a great translator. It was helping people going through post-separation abuse. So I decided to start posting about that on LinkedIn. And that's how I met you, Suchitra, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes, that's so wonderful, Reena. Thank you for sharing your story with us. It's amazing how so many of us, through our own wounds, we then choose to become healers. So that other people may not go through the same kind of experience. So, a little bit about myself. I'm a gynecologist. I've been working in the NGO sector for the last 25 years here in India and across Asia. And after my 30-year-old marriage sort of came to an end, I realized how little information and support there was for women in India, particularly. And you may know that, our social cultural context is such that marriage is seen as a sacred union, which is supposed to last not only this lifetime, but sometimes even 7 lifetimes. So as you can understand, it's quite a burden.
I grew up in the Catholic Church, and right. I get it. Yeah. 7 lifetimes.
Absolutely. So as you can imagine, it's quite a burden and a lot of shame and stigma especially for women who are expected to always hold the family together and to, sacrifice and do whatever is needed. So with the lack of information that I found, as just like you did, I discovered my mentor, Catherine Woodward Thomas, with whom I did the conscious uncoupling coach training. And that is what I'm currently offering to my clients. So thank you so much that, someone like you moved to another country, you went through such a difficult situation, but from that you chose to emerge to help people. So could you just give me a bit of a background on what is the situation like with marriages and divorces, maybe both in your country of origin as well as in Canada?
Well, my the country I grew up in, it's not my country where I was born, but where I grew up was South Africa. And I left there when I was 28. And I mean, people got divorced there. That was the thing. So divorces, I mean, but in the generation before my generation, and in Ireland, the country where I'm from, I'm also an Irish citizen.
Right.
It was much more difficult back then to get divorced, especially in Ireland. In Ireland, it was unheard of. You had to go to the Catholic Church and get an annulment, and it was really difficult. And there were a lot of steps to go through. And like in India, women who did leave their husbands, they were shamed, and it was taboo, literally. So I can understand that. By the time my generation came, things had changed. And when I moved to Canada as well, of course, being in an abusive relationship, it's, you still get gaslit about some things, about expectations and everything. So it was almost like I was in this little bubble of living with someone who expected me to do certain things as a good wife, and divorce was never an option for me in my head.
Hmm.
But in Canada, it's pretty acceptable. And I just want to quickly take this opportunity to explain what the situation is like. I'm not just in Canada. I'm actually in Quebec, which is a province of Canada. And it is the only province in Canada where the only official language is French. And Quebec also has its own laws, because the rest of Canada is based on common law, like British common law, right? But Quebec, because of its French origin, is based on civil law, Napoleonic law. And so certain things in Canada, in Quebec, are governed by Canadian law, federal law, we call it common law, and that's marriage. But certain things are governed by civil law in Canada, and that's if people do not get married and they just live with someone, they're governed by Quebec law. So you fall under two different laws. And in Quebec, what happened was, because Quebec was also a very Catholic province, about a generation before mine, and then in the late 60s, we had what was called the Quiet Revolution here, and everything upended. The church lost all its authority over people, and people actually went to the other extreme. And now what you find in Quebec is that more than half of the people don't get married at all. They what's called shack up in common parlance, or and it's actually been shown, the trend is that in future years only 26% of women and 30% of men will marry before their 55th birthday.
Wow.
So at the moment, it's like more than half of people in Quebec don't get married.
Right.
So when they do separate from their partners, the separation doesn't fall under the Divorce Act of Canada,
Right.
but it falls under the Quebec civil code, and there are different rules that apply.
Wow.
And yes.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. It always fascinates me how much we are entangled in legal requirements for marriage, because when before you get married, it's projected as this romantic best day of your life, the happiest thing you could do for yourself.
Yeah.
And no sooner have you sort of said I do and signed on the dotted line, suddenly, as you said, you're governed by multiple layers of laws, and which make it very difficult for you to leave. So that really, always reinforces for me the fact that the law is actually there not for the protection of the women in the marriages, but when it started off, I suppose it was for protection of property and inheritance through the male line,
Yes,
and hence the struggle.
In Europe, it was actually the Catholic Church that introduced marriage because people weren't getting married, and there was no control over the property or anything like that, and that's why they introduced marriage. In South Africa, actually, shortly, I got married in 1990, and not too long before that, women were not allowed to open bank accounts or take on debt or whatever without their husband's permission if they were married, and that was not very long before I got married, and.
Wow.
Yes, and women's everything that women owned was like their husband's property as well. I can't quite remember, but the law changed shortly before I got married in South
Wow.
Africa. So
We need a silent revolution. I think it's a universal it's a universal situation. I think
yeah,
all women need to participate in a silent or maybe even not so silent revolution to change our
yes.
situations.